Hello and welcome back to Invisible Hate. I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.
Today we're going to Arcata, California, a small college town between the Redwoods and the Pacific. It's April 15th, 2017, and a large house party has been going on for hours. Attendees include both Humboldt State University students and locals. Around 2 a.m., David Josiah Lawson, a 19-year-old black sophomore, arrives at the party with his girlfriend, a roommate, and two friends. As they are exiting the house to leave an hour later, they encounter Lily Ortega, a local woman, and her boyfriend, Kyle Zollner, and her three friends. Zollner says his girlfriend has misplaced her iPhone. Ortega says it's been stolen and tells the group to empty their pockets. Ortega and Lawson's girlfriend start fighting, then their boyfriends step in and get into a tussle. The fight breaks up after a few minutes and the two groups part ways, but once Lawson's girlfriend realizes she's been pepper sprayed, the fight continues. At some point, Zollner is on top of Lawson, both men on their backs, and Lawson's arms wrapped around his neck and arms. A friend separates the two and sees blood on Lawson. He'd been stabbed multiple times. Lawson is pronounced dead at 4:07 a.m. This is Invisible Hate. Welcome back to Invisible Hate, a weekly true crime podcast in which Saadia and I attempt to uncover the ugly truth behind various hate crimes, both recent and historical.
That's right, Asad. Many of the cases that we discuss involve crimes committed against minority groups. Our goal is to determine through a discussion of the nuances and complexities of these unfortunate situations whether or not these transgressions can be considered hate crimes. As will soon become clear, today's case appears to fit many of the criteria for a hate crime, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the case, Asad, how are you doing?
Yeah, Saadia, I'm doing great. I'm getting over this illness that you seem to just have gotten. Is that correct?
Yes, Asad. I don't know what to name this illness. For listeners, it's just a really, really bad cough. It gets worse at night. I don't have fever. It's not COVID. It's not cold, but it's something. And it's really bothering me. And Asad, I think you had the same thing.
I think I had the same thing a couple of weeks ago. My wife has it now. I think it's been going around, and unfortunately, it's not great, and there's nothing you can do except just rest and wait it out.
Exactly, Asad. So do you want to get started before both of us start coughing?
I know. Yeah, I think we probably should get this over with before we just all have a coughing fit on the podcast. Okay, Saadia, let's explore the setting first. Arcata is a mostly liberal but very homogenous city full of white hippies as well as blue-collar fishermen and loggers. Humboldt State is a small public polytechnic university and resides in Arcata. Despite being near the Oregon-California border, nearly 40% of the student body is actually from Riverside County, which is east of Los Angeles. There's a pattern of tension between the university and the surrounding community, as well as the local police department and people of color. Lawson is the first in his family to go to college and is excited about the change of scene from Southern California to Northern. Raised by a single Jamaican-American mom, he's compassionate, energetic, and ambitious, having graduated from high school with honors. At Humboldt State, he is studying criminal justice and hopes to pursue a career in public service. He's athletic, outdoorsy, and the life of the party with a big smile and a big heart. Despite being popular, Lawson feels a bit out of place in Arcata, according to his friends. He's not used to the lack of diversity and has been called derogatory names. There are even a few Confederate flags floating around, which is kind of crazy since 2017. He joins and becomes president of Brothers United, a cultural group at Humboldt State predominantly for Black male students.
Asad, I am a bit confused because we've already established that this is a liberal town, and yet it is so sad that Lawson still is facing a lot of derogatory remarks, racism, aggression, which really breaks my heart, right? Because for a liberal town, you would think that these things did not exist, but unfortunately they do.
Yeah, Saadia, you're absolutely right. I was shocked too. Lawson has recently started dating Ren Bobadia, and they head off to an off-campus party with friends on the evening of April 15th, 2017. The party is large and rowdy with 100 to 150 attendees, including over a dozen members of Brothers United. Meanwhile, a student from the College of the Redwoods, Lily Ortega, cannot find her new iPhone at the party. Upset, Ortega calls her boyfriend, Kyle Zollner, to come help her find her phone. Zollner is a 23-year-old chef from nearby McKinleyville. He is an introvert and a homebody, and he was at home playing video games at the time of the call. He's described as smart, humble, and musically inclined, just a friendly working-class guy. He has a record that consists of possession of meth, which he pled no contest to, but no violent crimes. As Lawson and his friends head out of the house around 3 a.m., Zollner mentions the missing phone to them. Ortega essentially accuses them of having stolen the phone. A friend of Lawson tells Zollner to calm his girlfriend down because accusing strangers of taking her phone isn't right. A fight starts out, but it's broken up. Then Lawson's group leaves and is heading to their car when his girlfriend notices her eyes burning and realizing that she's been pepper sprayed. She turns around and goes back to confront Ortega and her friend. Lawson heads back to get his girlfriend so they can leave. Somehow, Lawson and Zollner engage in a fight again, this time in the yard behind a red Ford Mustang. They are wrestling, and it's unclear who initiated the fight, where the knife emerged from, and if anyone besides Zollner is involved. At some point, though, Lawson is stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. One of the slashes slices his heart.
So this is so sad. It's so disheartening, how all these events happened, right? And what really saddens me that it started with a missing iPhone and a person assuming that somebody stole it, right? I mean, that is where all of this started.
Such a stupid thing to lose a life over, right?
Exactly.
So Saadia, friends waiting for Lawson head toward the fight and find him bleeding. One punches Zollner, who retreats and lays slumped over in the yard, and it's clear that Lawson needs a lot of help. They start putting pressure on the wounds and perform CPR. And Saadia, just imagine the scene. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning, and this party has been going on for hours. Up to 150 college-age kids, and some reports say many more, are mingling about the house and the dark yard, several drunk and or on drugs. The crowd is said to be aggressive and chaotic once the fights break out. And I should state clearly that the narrative I've told thus far and will continue to tell seems to be the one most commonly accepted, though there are a slew of conflicting accounts. Here's how we think it went down this part of the night. The first 911 call is placed around 2:50 and mentions a fight that's brewing. A second 911 call occurs about 12 minutes later and reports a stabbing, followed by several more calls. One dispatcher is handling all the calls, which contributes to a slight delay. 3 officers arrive separately between 3:03 and 3:05 and try to assess the scene. So it's about 13 to 15 minutes after the first initial call about the fight that was brewing.
Asad, how long is response time on average? Like, this seems like a short response time, right? But I'm thinking, is 12 minutes too long?
Yeah, I don't know what what a typical response time is, I would say it's a couple minutes, especially in an urban area, especially in a place like a campus like this that probably has their own security or police, department on campus. And so in that sense, it could be a matter of minutes. But, as we mentioned, the dispatcher was handling a lot of calls. So, it's kind of one of those things where, if you get 20 calls at once, can you talk to your police officers, quick enough to get them to the scene? I mean, these are professionals, and so...
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, Saadia, partygoers are actively fleeing as the first officer arrives. That officer detains Zollner, who is beat up, has bloody clothes, and is said to be responsible for the stabbing. The officer handcuffs him and puts him in his patrol car. He stands watch because several people are angrily trying to get at Zollner. The other two officers try to do some crowd control, and there is a big discrepancy between the accounts of Lawson's friends who are doing CPR and say the police officers don't help them for 15 minutes, and the first responders who claim they take over the CPR quickly and are trying to prepare for a defibrillator. At 3:05, a call from medical help comes into the fire department, which first has to be channeled through the California Fire Dispatch Center. Apparently, the police also need to grant clearance to medical personnel to enter the scene. Did you know that, Saadia?
I didn't, Asad, and I'm really confused right now. Like, instead of saving somebody's lives, a lot of people are following protocol, and I get why they would do it, just to avoid maybe liability or to follow certain guidelines. But at the same time, somebody's dying, right?
So Saadia, it is kind of standard practice that basically the scene has to be secured first before first responders can go in. And of course, that doesn't make the process of getting to Lawson easier. At the same time, a fire truck arrives at 3:09. One EMT heads directly towards Lawson and encounters the police officers doing CPR with a crowd around them. Another EMT comes over and they drag Lawson out from under the bushes rather roughly to gain better access. The surrounding crowd reacts angrily and begins pushing and shoving and yelling at the EMTs. Some of the responding officers later report being afraid of the group of Brothers United hovering over them. Ortega, who is standing by, allegedly says, and I quote, "I hope that N-word dies." By 3:15, an ambulance arrives, but there are people blocking the path to Lawson and trying to insert themselves in the response. Lawson, meanwhile, is bleeding out, his eyes closed, and drool or foam is coming out of his mouth. Friends ask if they can take him to the hospital, which is right down the street. In their opinion, the responders are trying to de-escalate the crowd and not focusing on getting the gurney to their friend. A first responder says Lawson is okay and that they will handle it. They're able to load Lawson on the gurney and put him in the ambulance. A friend insists on riding along, holding onto the ambulance door, but is finally pushed away from the doors. According to the police chief, Lawson has a pulse and the EMTs are still doing CPR in the ambulance. It departs the scene at 3:21, a good timeline by industry standards. Lawson arrives at the hospital momentarily and is rushed into surgery. Friends head over to the hospital. As we mentioned, it was just down the street. The one who asked responders if he's okay is told by the nurse there that Lawson was gone before he even arrived at the hospital. At 4:07, he is pronounced dead. The crowd at the hospital is distraught, and hospital staff set up a grief room for counseling. Meanwhile, a 10-inch kitchen knife is found under that Mustang near where the fight was. Brief interviews are done, and Zollner is taken into custody. And meanwhile, just a note, Ortega's phone is found.
This is I don't even have words to react to this. I mean, her phone is found. That's good news, right? But it is so sad. It is so sad. So we have already established that Zollner was the one who stabbed Lawson, right?
I think that's the assumption based on all the information that we have here. He's in the back of the police car right now, and I think everybody, because of the fight that happened, is assuming that he's the one, but I don't think we've officially kind of established that from at least the police perspective.
I have so many thoughts. If the crowd was not as chaotic and as rowdy, would they have been able to take Lawson to the hospital earlier, and would his life been saved, right?
Right.
That's the first question that comes to mind. Then the second question, again, could they have done something else? The hospital was so close. Could the crowd, his friends, have taken him to the hospital when this happened? There's so much that could have avoided, but unfortunately, Lawson is dead. Zollner is in custody. So I want to know more. What's the investigation like?
Yeah, Saadia, why don't we take a quick break and then we'll talk more about the investigation.
Welcome back to Invisible Hate. So Asad, talk to me about the investigation.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, Zollner is in custody and he is charged with murder a few days later and pleads not guilty. His fingerprints are not on the knife.
What?
Yeah, Zollner reports that he was knocked unconscious in the fight and doesn't remember what happened, but would rather be beat up than stab someone. A few days later, after the killing, Arcata Vice Mayor Sofia Pereira says tearfully, and I quote, "As a community, we failed Josiah and we failed other students of color who stated over and over again that they do not feel safe or welcome here." Some community members demand that the district attorney's office charge Zollner with a hate crime. Whether or not this was a hate crime, the racialization of the case polarizes the community. A preliminary hearing starts on May 1st, 2017, so just a few weeks after the crime. After 5 days of testimony, Judge Dale Reinholdson determines there's insufficient evidence to bring the case to trial. The judge notes that there's conflicting witness testimonies, no direct witnesses to the stabbing, and no proof the knife is Zollner's, who, remember, is a chef and does keep a knife kit in his car. At the time of this preliminary hearing, most of the evidence is being analyzed and no DNA testing is complete. Zollner is released and nobody else is indicted. The student body and Lawson's family and friends are outraged, but the whole city feels traumatized. Everyone is on edge. The police receive a ton of criticism based on their shoddy investigation, and the chief of police responds that he takes the feedback seriously. Posters asking for information about the crime are pulled down, and Arcata residents avoid conversation about it because it's, quote, too political. Brothers United members who are advocating for Lawson are said by some to be harassing residents. The animosity highlights long simmering racial tensions between Humboldt State students and local residents. In 2001, there was another case involving a murdered Black Humboldt State student that went cold, and the Trump administration, of course, only exacerbated racism there. Series of talks addressing race relations start taking place in the community. Many of the students feel like the Humboldt administration listens to the complaints but takes no action. A student talks about how the school recruits students of color to fulfill some kind of diversity quota, in their opinion, but isn't equipped to handle the tensions. Take a listen to this clip from a documentary we found.
The Dean of Students, okay? She wrote her master thesis in 1996, okay? About why students of color don't feel safe on Humboldt's campus. I was 4 years old, okay? 4 years old. Then I come to this school when I am 17 and y'all having the same problems. I graduate, y'all having the same problems. A student's murdered, y'all having the same conversations about what to do. It seems like this is just what Humboldt is.
Meanwhile, as mothers often do in the cases we've covered, Charmaine Lawson gets involved and becomes her son's voice. She contends that the city of Arquetta and the Humboldt County DA's office are engaged in cover-ups, racism, and nepotism. She contacts former FBI officer and private investigator Tom Parker, who agrees to look into the case. After discovering what he calls glaring incompetence in the Arquetta Police Department, he takes the case on pro bono. Almost 2 years after the murder, Humboldt County DA Maggie Fleming, under extreme pressure from the community, reviews evidence in the case and commissions a criminal grand jury. The jury hears from 25 witnesses and forensic analysts. The jury is shown a piece of evidence that is not present at the preliminary hearing, according to an anonymous juror, and that is apparently the knife is tested and blood from both Lawson and Zollner is found on it. Initially, 15 of the 18 jurors think Zollner is guilty. 12 guilty votes are needed for the case to proceed to court. But on the third day, they vote not to indict, concluding that the stabbing could have been in self-defense. Afterwards, the anonymous juror says that the assistant DA, Joel Buckingham, was pushing for a self-defense verdict, and he feels that the jury failed. District Attorney Fleming confirms that providing grand juries with information about the possibility of self-defense is required by law and especially appropriate in this case since Zollner is believed to have been initially hit by Lawson. But Zollner never stated to the detective who interviewed him that night that he stabbed Lawson or that it was in self-defense. The grand jury also concluded that a hate crime designation cannot be fully determined until a perpetrator is charged and their motive is explored. That part at least makes sense to me. Around the same time, police released new photos of potential witnesses and asked for anyone with new information to come forward. The DA claims they followed procedures appropriately in the case. But remember, Saadia, that Lawson's family hired a private investigator, and he's done his own research into everything. And when we come back after the break, we're going to hear his conclusions on what happened.
Welcome back to Invisible Hate. Asad, you've shared so much information with our listeners, and honestly, I am confused. There are so many things happening at the same time, right? So I am curious to know what happened once that FBI agent was hired by Mrs. Lawson.
So remember, Mrs. Lawson kind of wants to take things into her own hands and hire her own private investigator. So this guy named Parker is hired, and a special from PBS features Parker's take on the initial investigation, as well as a recording of police officers from dash cam footage. Take a listen.
In fact, going back to the night of the murders, there were only, I believe, 2 or 3 officers on duty. And when they came out to the scene, they really didn't even know how to protect the scene.
I'm glad you guys were there. I did not know what the I was doing.
So in his opinion, Saadia, Arquetta police really bungled this thing up from the start. Meanwhile, Saadia, the Humboldt County Civil Grand Jury, also reviews the Arquetta Police Department's response to the homicide and releases a report of its own in 2020. And they say that despite finding, quote, failures, ineptitudes, and poorly executed police work, it did not find direct evidence of racial bias, end quote.
So Asad, basically, to me, it seems like the police department, at the very least, did not investigate this thoroughly, right?
Yeah, that's not even all. In 2020, a report is released by the National Police Foundation, which is then made public by the city of Arquetta. The National Police Foundation is a nonprofit based in DC that works to advance police accountability. It's a long and detailed report, but essentially they find an appropriate focus on life-saving measures and public safety by first responders, but gross incompetence and mishandling of the investigation and the crime scene. This includes a lack of experience, not securing the scene or evidence, and not detaining witnesses for statements. Multiple agencies were involved, and no leadership or protocol was enforced. Officers made a mistake with a crucial interview in their reports, indicating that a potential witness to the stabbing had positively identified Zollner as the perpetrator when he'd only provided a description that vaguely matched Zollner. The police chief is chastised for not releasing more information to the public, nor assertively countering the divisive narrative that medical aid was largely delayed. Sadly, just one thing from this report that is kind of really glaring is that the lead detective in the case, a person by the name of Sergeant Todd Dockweiler, when he questioned Zollner that night, it was only for 15 minutes, and that lead detective was not at the scene and did not review photographs prior to the interview. And he cited it was because of a lack of resources. If someone is accused of, at that time, whether it was stabbing or murder, who knows, but to only be questioned for 15 minutes and not do your research, ahead of time just seems like a little ridiculous.
I said this is a huge mess up, right? We can see how the investigation was mishandled, how there was gross incompetence, and then not to question Zollner. Come on, he is the main suspect in this case, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if they weren't doing this because they were incompetent or racist. We cannot determine that, but there's something off here.
Yeah. The report overall does state that there was little evidence of bias. And, just to note, Saadia, improvements are made to the police department thanks to the foundation's review.
So I'm glad we have a National Police Foundation to hold police accountable for any mishandling or incompetence. We obviously need it in this day and age.
Yeah, for sure. Meanwhile, Lawson's mom sues the city and police department for violating her 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law with what she considers an incompetent and racist investigation. The city settles, paying her $200,000, which she doesn't cash, plus a mural and money for Lawson's scholarship fund, but they admit no wrongdoing. Meanwhile, DA Fleming is appalled that all witnesses from the party have not come forward and seems to want to bring charges, but says she needs more evidence. A new chief of police in Arquetta, a person by the name of Brian Ahern, and Lawson's mother plead again with the public for witnesses to come forward and also offer a reward. Ahern believes Zollner is responsible given the DNA on the knife. However, Zollner's attorney points out that her client has been through 2 proceedings and both found insufficient evidence. She also suggests that Ahern is pointing a finger at Zollner because of the impending civil suit against the police.
Oh, so Zollner is suing the police.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. In 2018, he brings a civil suit against the city for unlawful arrest, detention, and prosecution, for violating his constitutional rights, and for defamation by the police department. The suit is not resolved until 2022. Former Arquetta police officer Eric Losey is tentatively ordered to pay Zollner about $700,000 in addition to punitive damages of $50,000 for falsifying evidence in a witness report, as mentioned above, which basically identified him as the perpetrator before that was known.
So this is so confusing to me. So Zollner is getting $700,000 while Lawson's family got only $200,000. Is that true?
Yeah, this is the America that we live in, Saadia, right?
This is so messed up to me. And I'm also confused. There were 2 people in that fight, Asad. I assume Lawson wouldn't stab himself. So who else would really stab Lawson? That's my question. There was a knife, 2 people engaged in a brawl, and then one of them ends up dead due to stabbing, and yet we are confused as to who stabbed him.
No, it's a confusing situation. It was at night. It's dark. I think the other question is whether or not it was in self-defense. These are, all the things that obviously...
Yeah, but if it were self-defense, then Zollner would have admitted to self-defense, right?
Totally. And I just want to note, Saadia, that Zollner ends up not getting any of that money because a judge found that there was probable cause for him to be justifiably arrested. So just to note, he did not end up getting the $700,000.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. So what did they base probable cause on, Asad?
It's interesting, Sally, because I think of Zollner's suing the police. We ended up getting these kind of 6 factors from the judge as what supported probable cause. So the first one is the consistent account of one of Lawson's friends about what happened. 2 is the credibility and timeliness of the friend's statement. The third is that Zollner alone was identified by witnesses as fighting with Lawson. The fourth, that Zollner was alone, covered in blood, even on the back of his clothes, which is not consistent with his own injuries to the face. The fifth is that a kitchen knife was used. And of course, Zollner had several of those in his car. And then the final thing is that Zollner alone had the only apparent motive, as he admitted Lawson had, quote, sucker punched him that night. Take a listen here from a clip that we found from Humboldt Freelance Reporting on probable cause.
In regard to the probable cause for Zollner's arrest for Lawson's stabbing, Judge Corley wrote, quote, a reasonable officer could believe there was fair probability Mr. Zollner stabbed Mr. Lawson, unquote.
Well, let's get to the question of the hour. Is this a hate crime? So what do you think about this?
I said, despite this being a horrific, tragic incident in which a young life was lost and cut short, I don't think it was a hate crime because, first, we don't have enough information about Zollner, his character, his personality to know what kind of person he is. But on that day, he really doesn't utter any derogatory statements that evening. He has no record of violence or racist remarks as far as we know. And to me, honestly, his girlfriend initiated the phone search and the fight, not him. And then, add alcohol, drugs to the mix, add chaotic crowd to the mix, and this tragic, horrific incident happened. But I don't think he stabbed Lawson because of his identity.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. I think that this was just a really horrific escalation of violence that led to this murder. I do think that there's a lot of blame to go around here on the police and their incompetence in everything, from when they arrived to the scene to handling the scene to, after they arrested people and stuff like that. And I was thinking as I was reading through this again, Saadia, that there seems to be this common theme that we hear from our stories in which the police mess up and then there's a lot of work to kind of cover up that mess up.
Yeah.
I think there is some sort of understanding that, look, the job is really hard for police and that's why they have all these protocols and they have, all these kind of ways of doing things. And things are going to get messed up from time to time. But for me, I acknowledge that those mess ups will happen. We just want them to be forthcoming with them, right? And I think when they're not forthcoming, when they try to cover up again and again and again, that's where we seem to be going down these really, really awful years-long, decade-long cases that end up never being solved or just prolonging the hurt for the victims' families. It's just it's very frustrating, I think.
You're absolutely right, Asad. And to your point, I feel like all the cases that we've covered so far, police mess up usually, not always, but usually happens when the victim is a person of color.
Yeah.
And that, to me, goes back to our discussions that we've had many times on this podcast about systemic racism, structures and systems not being aligned with, finding justice for everybody. And that's where the problem really lies.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think we need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Saadia, for sure.
So, Asad, what's the latest?
Yeah, so you're not going to like this, Saadia. Even 7 years later, the case remains open. Zollner has maintained his innocence the entire time. Mrs. Lawson continues to advocate in Humboldt and started a Justice for Josiah committee and scholarship. Meanwhile, the police department in Arquetta is still investigating tips, but as of 2023, under half of the 100 plus people at the party have been identified and interviewed. According to a press release by police, new witness accounts that can corroborate information or create new leads are vital for progressing the case. So, Saadia, the bottom line is nobody has ever been held accountable for Josiah Lawson's murder.
This really breaks my heart, Asad, because I'm sure Josiah's mother would like to have a closure, right? And she's not getting that closure. Yeah, I mean, this is a sad story and a very sad ending to this tragic event.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Saadia. And, I think if people want to learn more, as always, we'll have links in the show notes about the case and ways that you can help. We want to thank you all for listening to this episode and bearing with us as we coughed through it all. If you have any thoughts on this story or any other stories that you think we should cover, please reach out to us at info@invisiblehatepodcast.com. Or if you have any remedies for a cold this season, we'd love that. You can also tweet us or hit us up on Instagram. Just search for Invisible Hate Podcast. Thanks again for listening. If you like what you hear, please share with a friend. Invisible Hate is a joint production of Rafaelion Media and Immigrantly. We'd like to thank our team, which includes Michaela Strather, Lindsay Gamble, Paroma Chakravarthi, and Emmanuel Monahan. Our music was done by Simon Hutchinson. We'll be back next week with another hate crime for us to analyze. Until then, I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.